So, what happens when a country's official history has a massive blind spot? Today, we're going to dig into the story of the Afro-Peruvian people, a community that's been almost completely erased from their nation's story. And this invisibility, well, it's so deep that a single, simple question from a child can unravel the whole thing.
Where did this black man come from? Just imagine hearing that question asked about your own father, in an elevator, in the apartment building you've lived in for 20 years. That one real-life, jarring moment, it's the spark for everything we're about to explore.
You see, that question from a kid in Lima, it wasn't just some awkward personal moment. No, it's actually a crack in the very foundation of a national identity. It shines a light on a much, much bigger problem: the systemic erasure of an entire group of people from Peru's history books.
Okay, so let's start right there, in that elevator, because this isn't just a personal anecdote. It's really our doorway into understanding Peru's incredibly complex and often contradictory sense of self.
So the man in that elevator was the father of our source's author, Luis Valdiviezo. And get this, they had been part of that building's community for over 2 decades. And yet to this child, his neighbor was a total stranger, an anomaly, someone who just didn't fit the picture of what a Peruvian was supposed to look like. It's a moment that just perfectly captures this profound invisibility of Afro-Peruvians, even in a place they call home.
Now, to really understand why that kid was so confused, we have to look at the official story Peru tells about itself. You know, the one that's taught in pretty much every single school across the country.
At the heart of it all is this concept called mestizaje. Now, it literally means mixture, which on the surface sounds amazing and inclusive, right? But in Peru, the official recipe for this cultural mix has been, well, let's just say it's very specific, and it leaves out some pretty major ingredients.
And here's that official recipe, laid out plain and simple. Peruvian national identity is built on 2 and only 2 main pillars: the Spanish heritage, that's the language, the religion, and the grand, epic, imperial Inca heritage. It's a powerful story of 2 roots, and it's what defines the nation.
And this isn't just some abstract idea. It is literally the foundation of the national school curriculum. History books are just filled with stories of Incas, Spanish conquistadors, and their descendants, the mestizos. But that leaves a huge question. If you don't come from one of those 2 groups, where do you fit in? The short answer? You don't.
And this is where things get really contradictory. Because on paper, Peru is all about celebrating diversity. But when you look at what actually happens in practice, it's a completely different story.
I mean, just look at the law. Peru's 1993 constitution and its education laws are crystal clear. They promise to protect ethnic and cultural plurality and to push for something called intercultural education. It sounds like the perfect solution, doesn't it?
But here is where that promise just completely falls apart. The policy says it recognizes diversity, but in reality, it ignores anyone who isn't from that Spanish or Inca background. It says it promotes dialogue, but it completely sidesteps the tough conversations about historical inequality. And the real kicker, instead of being for the whole education system, these intercultural programs are mostly just for rural, indigenous communities, not to celebrate their culture, but to help them blend into the dominant one.
So what you end up with is this huge paradox. You have a national policy of interculturality that doesn't actually include the country's real, full diversity. It's a system designed not to create a multicultural society, but to absorb minority groups into that main Spanish Inca story.
Which brings us right to the heart of this whole thing, the long, incredibly rich, and almost totally erased history of Afro-Peruvians.
By some estimates, 9% of Peru's population is of African descent. 9%! We're talking about millions of people. This is not some small, recent community. They are a huge part of the nation's DNA.
And their history is as old as modern Peru itself. Seriously, people of African descent showed up in the 16th century, right alongside the very first Spanish conquistadors. For centuries, their forced labor was the engine of the colonial economy. In the 19th century, they fought for their own freedom and were promised full citizenship. But then, when the 20th century rolled around and it was time to write the official story of Peru, they were just written out.
The historian Maria Rosvorovsky put it perfectly. She said that while the Spanish conquistadors cloaked themselves in glory, their unknown South Saharan companions lived and died in the most complete oblivion and anonymity. Their part in the story was just forgotten.
But here's the good news. That oblivion is now being challenged. There's a new generation of Afro-Peruvian thinkers, activists, and educators who are working to reclaim their history and rewrite that national narrative.
Groups like CEDET and Lundu and amazing community-led schools like the Yapatera High School, they aren't just complaining about the problem. They're actively building the solution. They are creating a brand new vision for what a truly inclusive Peruvian education could look like. And their plan is so clear and powerful. Step 1. Write new, multicultural history books that actually include everybody. Afro-Peruvians, Asian Peruvians, everyone. Step 2. Change how things are taught. Move past a purely Eurocentric worldview and challenge those old colonial ideas. And step 3. Create real, public conversations where all Peruvians can have a say in shaping a new, shared identity. In that goal, it brings us right back to where we started, that elevator. The whole point is to create an education system where a child's first encounter with an Afro-Peruvian isn't a moment of confusion, but a moment of recognition, of seeing a neighbor, a fellow citizen, whose story is part of the same national story as their own.
Of course, this story is bigger than just Peru. It really leaves all of us with a pretty big question to think about. If education is what shapes our identity, whose stories were left out of the version we were taught? And what could we all discover if we started looking for them?